Grüß, willkommen in einem anderen aufregendes video. Welcome to another exciting video, in this case episode 44 of my game system design series. In this video I'll be exploring Napoleonic rules variable base widths and using base widths as the measurement system within the rules. The topic of base widths in the figure gaming world is massive, and I've created an earlier video detailing the evolution of base widths in the Napoleonic area. However, one area I've not covered is the use of base widths as a form of measuring distance within rules. Almost all rules prior to DBN used a ruler, either inches or centimetres, to measure all distances. This was the seemingly most logical approach. However, when DBA, DBM and DBMM started using base widths as the primary form of measuring, the dominance of this older system was broken. I must admit, anyone who has converted a board game into a hexless figure gaming system would have gravitated to the concept of base widths, because those rules all use hexes as their primary form of regulating movement and direct fire, and base widths are a nice equivalence. However, this was most certainly a fringe area of the hobby, at least until recently, and few people attempted to convert board games into figure gaming formats. After DBN introduced this idea to the mainstream Napoleonic figure gaming community, I started converting board games into a hexless figure gaming format and used that system. I do not like this system, or I did not like this system when it was first introduced in the ancients world, but now I'm a really big fan of it. There are some rules scales where this system is not suitable, but for players who wish to reproduce entire battles, it was an easy fit to move to base widths rather than using a tape measure or ruler. This system can also be retrofitted to any older sets of rules if players really wish to do so. And the main benefit is the system is base width agnostic as a result. Thus players can have the same experience with 6mm figures using 2cm wide bases as if they use 25mm figures on 6cm wide bases. There's no need to do complex calculations, although you do need to be able to create the rules or modify the rules and mark off all distances into base widths, so some rounding is going to occur. There is one initial issue with using base widths, as at least initially most people felt that all bases need to be the same width if you're going to go down this path. Napoleonics in particular are fond of having different base widths for different troop types. WRG Wargame Rules 1685 to 1845, while it used the same base widths for infantry and cavalry, used a smaller base width for artillery, as an example. I'm not going to cover rules prior to 1979, but they generally had different widths for different troop types. Let's go through some of the rules that I will cover in this video. Let's start with the classic Napoleonic rules, which many UK-based gamers first played on a regular basis. The Wargame Rules 1685 to 1845 by Philip Barker. There were a few earlier editions, but this is probably the most common, or at least the most popular, at least today anyway. Putting skirmishers and artillery to one side, all bases were similar, which for 15mm figures was 3cm wide. Artillery, on the other hand, used 2cm wide base, which was done to allow each figure to represent only 2 guns, allowing players to form batteries of 6 or 8 guns. In reality, the width of each 2-gun could be rather significant and did vary a lot, but nonetheless this is what WRG felt the average width should be for 2 guns. Skirmishers used a 1.5cm wide base because they were actually half bases. This was done to avoid double basing figures, that is, having figures on a double width base. Another favourite on the other side of the so-called pond was Empire 3rd Edition, which I loved but was never actually able to learn the rules well enough to have a real game. I love the concept in the rules, but the execution was kind of lacking. At least that's what I felt. Empire 3rd Edition used a single basing system, which was rather old school by 1981, but even here you could see different base widths, from 3/8 of an inch to 3/4 of an inch per figure, based on, obviously, troop type. Corps Commander introduced what I call the standard US basing system, and is an underrated set of rules, in my opinion, especially in terms of historical impact. This basing system used 3/4 inch wide to 1 inch deep for infantry, or if you come from metric land, probably 2 centimetres wide by 3 centimetres deep. For cavalry and artillery, the width was 1 inch or 3 centimetres if you're metric. It's difficult to underestimate the impact, that is, rules impact, of the Napoleon's battles sets of rules. These rules heralded in an age of reproducing entire battles, rather than just a small part of it. They may not have been really big battles, but something like Marengo could easily be refought in a reasonable period and on a reasonably sized playing area using these rules. Napoleon's battles used a similar basing system to Corps Commander, with the only unusual aspect being the double-depth cavalry elements. This never really caught on, but the rest has become a form of standard basing for many sets of different US rules. Charcot are also highly underrated, I suspect because most people use them for more traditional, or use the more traditional scale rather than the optional higher battle scale, which I primarily liked. Using that higher scale, you could also reproduce entire battles, which is quite unusual for this period. Charcot is unusual as being a US set of rules, but it used a UK basing system. All bases in this case were the same, except skirmishers, which used a double width base, 2.5 inches in this case. There's no reason why you could not use a standard width for skirmishers with 2 per base and place 2 together, which is something many UK players did because that's the way they based their skirmishers prior, or at least with other sets of rules. Elan Deluxe Edition are freeware rules from Australia, which are surprisingly complete and detailed, but like many freeware rules, when the author moved on, they tended to lose interest and tended to disappear. The basing system for Elan was very similar to WRG, so it can be classed as a UK basing system set of rules. Garde du Corps have gone through many different versions. We'll only look at the 2004 version, which is available as a free download and is also very complete and very detailed, and I suspect the best of the 3 versions available. Garde du Corps 3rd edition uses the same base widths for all troop types, with skirmishers being on half bases. Very similar in many ways to WRG, except of course in this case the artillery have the same width as everything else. Another set of rules which I consider as being extremely good is Age of Eagles, and I think anyone interested in refighting entire battles should at least have a copy of these rules. Age of Eagles uses the US basing for infantry and also for cavalry, although the cavalry is not double based in terms of depth. However, the basing for artillery is different, which is different from Napoleon's battles. I suspect it's based on the Napoleon's battles basing system, but tweaked based on the way the author thought it should have been tweaked. DBN are the first commonly available set of commercial rules which use base widths as the method of measuring distance, at least in terms of Napoleonics and as far as I can work out. Obviously this occurred earlier with ancients, with DBA, etc. As with the other DB style of rules, all bases are the same width, and this uses the UK basing system. That's basically the history. As you can see, most rules use some form of variable base widths, with some minimal exceptions. Let's now discuss the potential issues with using variable base widths, starting with combat. The obvious issue is in melee, you get different numbers of elements facing each other. Let's look at Napoleon's battles, which uses a variable US base width system. This shows the situations using imperial measurement. If we move over to metric measurement, the situation ends up being cleaner, although I suspect this was never the game designer's intention. This may seem like there may be an imbalance, as 3 infantry elements can face 2 cavalry or artillery elements. Thus, they have a combat advantage. The cavalry may have a front line with advantages to compensate, that is, their front line is wider. On the other hand, as long as the combat values of the elements are correctly set, this should not be an issue. It would be very rare for cavalry to break infantry en masse, so giving infantry an advantage in this case, on the left for example, is very reasonable. On the right, the cavalry overlaps the infantry and may as a result have an advantage as a result. Once again, this is reasonable as cavalry would have been good at finding gaps and exploiting them, particularly on the flanks. If we look at a 3-rank French infantry against 2-rank British infantry, we can see the British can cover a greater frontage but has less density. In a melee, they would be in trouble as there are less infantry per, let's say, square metre in real terms, as can be seen on the left. On the other hand, we know 2-rank fire almost as well as 3 ranks if trained correctly, which the British were. So the British elements would have a greater fire combat value, giving them an advantage when attacked, at least historically, which is not actually reflected in this particular case with this basing. If we go to the old WRG rules, which are a UK variable base set of rules, we can see something similar with artillery. In this case, the artillery can achieve significant fire combat density against the charging cavalry, but once the cavalry hits the artillery, it would have been over Red Rover, based on the melee system. Variable base width issues with combat can be mitigated by ensuring the elements have the correct combat value based on their width. The next issue does not affect many sets of rules, but it's the base width measuring system issue. If your rules use base widths to measure movement and fire combat, this would normally require all elements to be the same width. This was at least something I originally believed in until I used Napoleon battles base figures, which are variable base figures, in a game which used base width rules. So the first issue is, when you have variable base widths, how do you calculate what the base width should be used for measurement? It's possible to ignore artillery when you're trying to come up with this value, but if we use Napoleon battles basing system, there's no real need to ignore artillery. You first need to identify the greatest base width, which is clearly not a half or double base width element, which can be common with skirmishers and artillery. Not an issue in this case. In this case, the greatest width is 3 centimetres. The other method is that you use the width of the greatest number of elements, which would be 2 centimetres, because that would be infantry normally. Thus, in this particular case, you could use a base width of 2 centimetres or 3 centimetres, and quite frankly, the player can choose which base width they wish to use. However, before we give the player that much choice, there is another factor to consider, the element depth. In this case, we also need to identify the depth of the most common element, which in this case is 3 centimetres because infantry and cavalry have this depth, and combined they are by far the most common elements. This is because retreats from combat can be, in some rules, 1 element width or 1 element depth, which in this case needs to be 3 centimetres in order to clear the element's original position. Players could still use a base width of 2 centimetres if they wished, and it would probably work, but in this case, the optimal base width to use is 3 centimetres equals 1 base width. There is another factor to consider. What about rules which use big bases or movement trays? In this case, as long as you drop the depth of artillery to 3 centimetres, assuming these are all Napoleon War basing figures, the elements can all fit neatly in a standard movement tray, which allows you to use this basing with rules which use movement trays. The issue may not be a major one for many games, as it depends on what rules you are using, but it's always wise to use a basing which gives you the greatest flexibility. In my case, I generally use UK basing for my Napoleonics, which is basically everything being 4 centimetres wide and the depth being 2 centimetres for infantry, 3 centimetres for cavalry and artillery. This gives me a basing system which allows me to use a host of different rules. On the other hand, in my case, I mainly use a board game conversion or a set of rules which is a figure game conversion of a board game, and this suits the US basing system. It does work with the UK basing system if you use movement trays, but it works much nicer when you use the US basing system for Napoleonics. So I'll be basing up a pair of force mixtures which use the Napoleon's Battle basing system as a result. This also allows me to play a number of US sets of rules in addition. Thus, in conclusion, while I still don't like variable base widths, as long as all the same troop types have the same width, with some variation allowed for 2 versus 3 rank, it's possible to have different base widths for different troop types. While this issue may not be a major one for more traditional Napoleonic figure gamers, for those who like the idea of converting a Napoleonic board game into a hexless figure gaming format, this allows them to use US-based figures. If you wish to avoid movement trays, the US basing system offers significant advantages. After all, a board game counter is normally half an inch square, which is close in shape to an infantry element 2 centimeters wide by 3 centimeters deep. For those who may be interested, this shows a possible method to determine what figures you need to purchase for a force mix. Anyway, this is one possible figure. This is a perennial issue I have. Whenever I want to get a new army, what do I initially buy? I want to make sure that I don't over-purchase some troop types and under-purchase others. Anyway, this system is based on the core, shown here, where the scale is from 1,000 to 2,000 men per infantry element. However, the ratio used are similar if the basic formation in your army is a division, such as when you're using a scale of 200 to 600 men per infantry element. You can play around with the scale. I'm just showing you an example where we're showing a core, where the scale is 1,000 men, or 1 to 2,000 men per actual element. Once I've identified a core, which is the top row, this becomes my basic maneuver unit, and I multiply it as many times as required. Typically you need at least 4, which gives you about 50 elements per side. I normally multiply this by 6, as I have a set of rules where reinforcements are very common and it's possible to field 6 cores in a game. You do also need what I consider as army level formations, or at a lower scale corps level formations if your basic maneuver element is a division, for example, as well as formations such as cavalry corps or other special corps. Starting with the highest level command, 2 heavy artillery elements is my advice, 1 per pair of corps, for example. Cavalry corps vary massively. This is a possible example modelled on the French. Some armies didn't even have a cavalry corps. There are also special corps such as advanced formations, and these also varied a lot, but normally had a high number of light infantry and more cavalry supporting it. Once again, this example is modelled on an Austrian advanced corps, and players need to put a little bit of thought into how they create their special corps. The early Austrian equivalent also contained a lot of grenadiers. The French also used grenadier divisions prior to 1812, a special formation that may be a good idea to field. You also need to consider guard corps, which may differ from standard corps. If you field 4 standard corps and 1 each of the above special corps, as well as army support formations, you probably have a reasonable force mix that will cover most circumstances using probably most rules, of course assuming that the rules all use a similar scale. This shows the same totals but using figures. Depending on the brand, the cost can vary quite a bit, but I'd expect something like this to cost about £180, possibly £200 once you include command figures and any special elements you wish to add. At this scale, skirmishing is not really a thing, so at a lower scale you may wish to also purchase some additional skirmishers. And so we come to an end of my episode 44, my video on game system design, in this case looking at Napoleonic rules basing widths, using them as a measuring system, and variable base widths based on troop types. Alle guten Dingen kommen zu einem Ende.